We all know the movie Iron Man kicked off the MCU back in 2008, but over the next decade, Tony Stark himself was an essential part of shaping the MCU as we know it today. As we get ready to head into the fourth phase of Marvel movies following Spider-Man Far From Home, let's take a look back and celebrate some of his most awesome moments. Keep watching to see if your favorite scene made the cut. If you're a comic book fan, then you've known who Iron Man is for quite some time. He's the distinctly unlikable character Stan Lee managed to make audiences somehow like, but back in 2008, Marvel Studios was banking on the movie The Incredible Hulk being a huge hit due to the increased recognition of the main character. They were just hoping Iron Man didn't bomb at the box office, especially since it starred wildcard actor Robert Downey Jr. But, interestingly enough, Iron Man was a huge hit, and The Incredible Hulk is one of those Marvel movies most people forget exists. No small part of the movie's success was owed to Robert Downey Jr.'s masterful portrayal of Tony Stark and one of the many lines he ad-libbed in the movie. In the comic books, most superheroes guard their secret identity, so announcing "I am Iron Man" at the press conference would be unheard of. But hey, as we all know, Tony Stark was a bold guy. The scene even shocked Marvel studio head Kevin Feige, but he realized it made sense for the character and then decided to go with it. Even to this day, it stands out as not only one of the most iconic Iron Man moments, but one of the most iconic Marvel movie moments, period. One of the many reasons Tony Stark's journey was so compelling was because in many ways, it paralleled that of the biggest villain in the MCU, Thanos. Both characters are egotistical and believe that they know what's necessary to save the world. They have access to great power and resources and legions of people loyal to them. But while Thanos is downright cruel at worst and insensitive at best, Tony is a much more compassionate person. Thanos wanted to destroy half of all life in the universe in order to save it, and Tony wishes that he could just encase it in a suit of protective armor. Not that his efforts always worked out the way he planned, but hey, his heart was in the right place. And speaking of Tony's plans not always working out right, in Avengers Age of Ultron, Tony admitted to being scarred by the Battle of New York. His greatest fear was the threat that he couldn't protect his loved ones from, especially if it comes in the form of aliens raining from the sky. Honestly, those are pretty valid fears, and in Avengers Endgame, we got to see him conquer them. When Thanos said, "I am inevitable," Tony countered with, "I am Iron Man," and then he used the Infinity Stones to save the day at the cost of his own life. It was a witty one-liner, a callback to the first Iron Man movie, and it made us cry. Tony Stark sacrificed his life in Avengers Endgame, but really, none of us doubted he would do so once we realized what was going on. Surprisingly, there was a time when Iron Man's character was called into question by one of his fellow Avengers. In the Avengers, Tony Stark made the acquaintance of Steve Rogers, and saying that they didn't hit it off right away is putting it mildly. Steve accused Tony of being unwilling to sacrifice himself for others. He said Tony would never lay down on the wire in order to let others crawl over him. Tony said he would simply cut the wire, but Steve retorted by saying that's not always an option. And hey, what do you know? Later in the movie, we saw Tony in a very dangerous situation with no real other options. Tony grabbed a hold of a nuke and then flew it through a wormhole to blow up a Chitauri ship. Not only did he save the day, but he got to prove Steve Rogers wrong, and it's hard to say which of those things Tony liked more. In Captain America Civil War, we saw Tony Stark reach out to Peter Parker when he needed his help fighting against Captain America. Now, while this may have started out of necessity, it soon blossomed into a beautiful mentor-mentee relationship. Okay, maybe it took a little while and there were some awkward moments along the way, but it was definitely all worth it in the end. In Spider-Man Homecoming, it was clear how desperate Peter was for Tony's approval. But Tony isn't known for being a warm and fuzzy kind of guy, and he even admitted he didn't exactly have a great paternal role model himself. When it came time for him to lay down the law with Peter after the ferry incident, it was a pretty heartbreaking scene. But it also showed that Tony had come to care for Peter and expected great things from him. When we first met Nebula in Guardians of the Galaxy, let's just say that she didn't exactly win us over with her sparkling personality, but it's hard to blame her since she was raised by Thanos, who constantly pitted her against Gamora, and then, would replace her body with robot parts when she lost. But although the two siblings managed to patch things up, Nebula was still very much an outsider going into Avengers Endgame. She had been stranded with Tony Stark at the end of Infinity War and then was stuck hopelessly adrift in space. But in the few moments we saw them together, it was clear he made a big impact on her. We saw Tony teaching Nebula how to play a paper football game and asked her if she was having fun. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but consider how much fun Nebula had while growing up with Thanos. This might have been the first time someone genuinely asked her if she was having fun in her entire life. It's no secret that Tony Stark can be hard to get along with. It seems like for every fan that hails him a hero, there's someone else who just can't stand him. While we were excited to see Tony declare he was Iron Man, not everyone was so enthused. In Iron Man 2, it became clear Senator Stern really had it out for Tony. He did his best to convince everyone that Tony wasn't a hero. He wanted Tony to hand over his super suits and went to great lengths to get rid of them. He even allied himself with Justin Hammer in order to get rid of Tony at one point in the movie, but it didn't work out, and he ended up having to present his nemesis Tony Stark with a medal for bravery. This was a super satisfying moment for both Tony and the audience, and in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, we learned Stern was worse than we thought and was actually working with Hydra. In retrospect, that makes this scene all the better. One of the interesting things about Tony is that he's a regular human being. Okay, he's a billionaire and a genius who figured out time travel, but biologically, he's a normal human being. The source of his powers are his various super suits and weapons, as opposed to other heroes with superhuman capabilities built into their bodies, such as Scarlet Witch or Spider-Man. Many people have tried to get Tony to give up being Iron Man, including the aforementioned Senator Stern and even Pepper Potts. But it seems like Tony has always known that being Iron Man is more than just wearing the suit. In Iron Man 3, there's an incredible scene where Tony blows up all of his Iron Man gear. He spent most of the movie trying to cope with his fear and trauma in the wake of the Battle of New York and built himself an army of suits, but in the end, he realized that he really is Iron Man regardless of what he's wearing. The suit doesn't make a hero, which is a lesson we saw him pass down to Peter Parker in Homecoming. Tony Stark and Pepper Potts have had some ups and downs over the course of their relationship. They started out with a huge power imbalance between the two of them and then eventually moved on to more mundane grievances. In Iron Man 3, Pepper Potts felt neglected, and Tony struggled to be open about his levels of anxiety, but despite it all, even when they were on a break, it's clear Tony has always loved Pepper and believed she's capable of great things. Superheroes saving their romantic partners is nothing new, and it's a trope that's been used over and over and over again. But in Avengers Endgame, Tony did something different. He built her an amazing supersuit of her very own, which enabled her to take part in the final battle against Thanos. Because of Tony's engineering, we got a reference to the A-Force and Pepper wearing a supersuit like she does in the comics. Saving your loved one is awesome, but giving them the tools to save themselves is even better. There was a lot going on in Captain America: Civil War, but much of the conflict surrounded the Sokovia Accords. These documents would turn the Avengers from a private institution to a group controlled by the United Nations. There are a lot of practical reasons a bunch of superpowered vigilantes should not be running around causing tons of property damage and then operating with a total lack of regulations. But then there's the side that argues the stipulations put forth in the Accords were too authoritarian and could have some dire repercussions in the event of an emergency. So we're not going to say whether signing the Sokovia Accords was right or wrong because there's no clear-cut answer here, but we're going to give credit to Tony Stark for doing what he thought was right and taking responsibility for his actions. We know cooperating with others and following orders aren't easy for him, but he was willing to do so, thinking that it would make the world a safer place. Understandably, being on opposite sides of the Sokovia Accords put some strain on the relationship between Iron Man and Captain America. Things were already pretty contentious when Tony found out the truth about what really happened to his parents. They lost their lives during a confrontation with Bucky Barnes when he was being controlled as the Winter Soldier. Tony understandably found this hard to take, and all the more so when he learned his friend Steve had known about it for quite some time. These feelings of hurt and betrayal resulted in a massive and tragic battle, but we definitely wouldn't say this was one of Iron Man's best moments. Instead, we want to talk about Avengers Endgame. Tony called out Steve for disappearing on him, and it was clear he wasn't happy with how they'd left things. Forgiveness has never been Tony's strong suit, but he was able to admit that resentment is corrosive and he wanted to move forward. He even insisted Steve take his shield back, and the two were able to put the past behind them. Say what you will about Tony Stark, but the man knows how to make an entrance. Sure, we've learned over and over again that being a superhero isn't just about being flashy. It's not about having the best weapons, the biggest muscles, or even the best butt in the MCU. It's what's inside that truly counts, and we definitely agree with the message. But that being said, who doesn't love a flashy, over-the-top superhero entrance? In Iron Man 2, Tony Stark shows up to the Stark Expo, and of course, he does not quietly walk out on stage in a three-piece suit. Instead, he shows up in his Iron Man suit by falling out of the sky with AC/DC's Shoot the Thrill playing. There's women dancing and the big old image of the American flag. It's ridiculous, over the top, and totally Tony Stark. In fact, Tony also makes a grand entrance in the Avengers to the same song. When the team confronts Loki, Tony overrides the sound system in Natasha's craft in order to play his choice of music. He just can't do the perfect three-point superhero landing without the proper ambience. Tony Stark has done a lot of heroic things over the course of his superhero career in the MCU. It seems like he has a super suit or a crazy gadget for just about every possible contingency, but sometimes there's just no substitution for a bit of creative brilliance, and Tony certainly has plenty of that. In Iron Man 3, Tony takes remote control of his armor to the Air Force One in an effort to save the president. The good news is that Tony managed to take down Eric Savin, but the bad news is that Tony did so after Eric had planted a bomb. It went off, tearing a hole in the plane and forcing its passengers to fall thousands of feet to certain doom. Thankfully, Tony also apparently had a lot of experience playing games, since he suggested he and the passengers do their best impression of Barrel of Monkeys. He helped everyone form a human chain and then drop them into the water below at a safe distance. Not only did Tony save the day, but he was able to do so from a distance, which is probably a good thing, considering his armor promptly got smashed moments after the rescue. Remember when we said Tony keeps a set of armor for just about every occasion? Well, although he ended up fighting against Captain America in Civil War, he made a suit specifically to stand up against another member of the Avengers, the Incredible Hulk. Making a super suit to fight against your friend is generally frowned upon, but thankfully, Bruce Banner was on board with the whole thing. After all, Bruce spends the most time out of anyone battling the Hulk. In Avengers: Age of Ultron, Tony had the chance to put his giant Hulkbuster armor to good use when the Hulk went on a rampage. We all know Hulk is one of the strongest characters in the MCU, so this was an absolute beast of a fight. But not only did he manage to hold his own, he saved some lives while he was at it, and then after dropping Hulk into a building and delivering one heck of a wallop to his head, he finally managed to subdue him. Although he was down a tooth, the Hulk managed to survive the encounter, and we were all left impressed at the strength of Tony's armor. Earlier, we mentioned that Iron Man started out as a pretty unlikable character in the comic books. Stan Lee decided to introduce a warmongering character during the Cold War because, hey, he likes a challenge, and in the movie Iron Man, we got to see Tony fully realize the downside of making a profit selling weapons. Tony ends up captured in a cave where the Ten Rings want him to build a Jericho missile. Instead, Tony and his ally Ho Yinsen build a set of armor designed to help them escape. Earlier, we hailed Tony's ability to make an entrance, but it turns out he makes a pretty amazing exit too. Tony certainly made an impression on his kidnappers when he escaped from that cave. Sure, it left him hungry for cheeseburgers, but it also left him a profoundly changed man. Not only did he learn the harsh reality of his chosen profession, but he watched someone sacrifice his life for Tony's. Few people could walk away from such an experience unchanged, and thankfully, Tony isn't one of them. This made it even less surprising that Tony was willing to sacrifice his life for others later on. Earlier, we talked about Tony Stark defeating Thanos for good in Avengers Endgame. He wasn't there the first time our heroes confronted the Mad Titan in that movie, but he made up for it later. Now, let's take a look back at Avengers Infinity War and talk about when Tony took on Thanos on his home turf. Let's be honest, things looked really bad for our heroes at this point. Thanos already had several Infinity Stones and was on his way to obtain the Time Stone from Doctor Strange. It seemed like our hero's only hope was a plan requiring precise cooperation from each and every hero available. And then Star-Lord messed it all up. When he found out Thanos had taken out Gamora, he momentarily forgot about the plan, lunged at Thanos, and messed everything up. But despite this, Tony still went up against Thanos, even knowing his odds of success were incredibly minute. He knew he couldn't live with himself knowing that he didn't do everything possible to try to save those he cares about. This made it all the more tragic when, despite his best efforts, he realized he couldn't do anything to save Peter Parker. We know there are no shortage of awesome Iron Man moments in the MCU, so tell us which one was your favorite in the comments section below. And then click on the subscribe button for more of the latest and greatest videos from us here at CBR. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.